Abigail Harper pressed both hands flat against the cold kitchen counter and stared at 6 plates she had no idea how to fill. Outside, boots stomped across frozen ground. A door slammed hard enough to rattle the window above the sink. And somewhere down the dark hallway of a house that smelled like dust and old grief, a 5-year-old boy was dragging a wooden stool toward a stove he had no business touching because nobody else in that house had thought to feed him. Abigail moved before she thought. She crossed the kitchen in 4 steps, caught the stool before it scraped another inch, and looked down into the smallest face she had ever seen wearing that much exhaustion. "I got it, baby," she said quietly. "I got it from here." That was the moment Abigail Harper understood exactly what kind of trouble she had walked into. If you're new here, please subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens next is going to stay with you. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The Greyhound pulled out of Billings just past 4 in the morning, and Abigail Harper did not watch it go. She stood on the shoulder of a 2-lane road outside a town called Carver's Crossing, Montana, with 1 suitcase at her feet and a coat she had bought secondhand from a Salvation Army bin on the south side of Chicago. The coat was too thin for Montana in February. She had known that when she bought it. She had bought it anyway because it was the only one left in her size, and Abigail Harper had spent enough of her life waiting for things to come in her size to stop being surprised when they didn't. The cold hit her the way Montana cold always hit people who came from somewhere else. Not gradually, not politely, but all at once like a door swung open onto nothing. She picked up her suitcase, tucked her chin into the collar of the thin coat, and started walking toward a pair of headlights idling at the far edge of the gravel lot. The truck was old. The kind of old that meant it had been repaired so many times the original parts were more memory than metal. It sat crooked, the left rear tire worn down lower than the right, and the passenger window had a crack running diagonally from corner to corner that had been patched with electrical tape that was already peeling at one end. The man behind the wheel did not get out. Abigail reached the passenger door and stood there for a moment. She could see him through the cracked glass hat brim, pulled low, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on his knee. He was looking straight ahead, not at her. She opened the door herself. The interior smelled like motor oil, dried mud, and something underneath both of those things that she could not name right away. It took her until she had pulled the door shut and set her suitcase between her feet to realize what it was. It was the smell of a house where nobody had been cooking. That particular hollow, stale quality that air takes on when a kitchen has gone unused for too long. She had smelled it once before in her grandmother's house in the weeks after her grandmother died, when Abigail had gone back to sort through things and found a pantry full of cans nobody had opened. "Abigail Harper," she said, because somebody had to say something. "Ethan Walker," the man said. He put the truck in reverse without looking at her. She studied his profile in the dark. He was younger than she had expected from the letter, or maybe not younger, maybe just harder, in a way that made age difficult to read. Sharp jaw, deep-set eyes, the kind of lines around his mouth that came not from smiling, but from years of holding an expression flat so nobody could see through it. He had not shaved in several days. His hands on the wheel were the hands of a man who worked with them constantly, knuckles enlarged, one thumbnail blackened from some old injury. He did not look at her once during the 40-minute drive to the ranch. She did not try to make him. She had read his letter 7 times before she answered it. Not because she needed convincing, but because she wanted to know exactly what she was walking into. The letter had been brief, almost clinical 5 sentences, handwritten, stating the facts without apology. Widower. 6 sons, ages 5 through 19. Ranch in financial distress. In need of a capable woman willing to work. No romantic expectations. She had appreciated the honesty more than she could explain to people who had never read a personal advertisement that promised things it had no intention of delivering. Her sister Pauline had called her out of her mind. "You're going to marry a stranger," Pauline had said, standing in the middle of Abigail's empty apartment, the eviction notice still taped to the outside of the door. "A stranger with 6 children, Abby. 6. I know how many 6 is." You've never even had one." That's not what his letter said he needed. What did his letter say he needed? Abigail had folded the letter back into its envelope and slid it into her coat pocket. "Someone capable," she said. "That I can do." Pauline had stared at her, the way people stared at Abigail when she did something they could not categorize. It was a specific kind of stare, the kind that preceded words like reckless or naive, or when people were being less careful, desperate. Abigail had been on the receiving end of that stare her entire adult life. She had learned to walk through it the way you walked through fog steadily, without speeding up, without pretending it wasn't there. She was 38 years old. She had managed a bakery in the Pilsen neighborhood for 11 years before the owner sold the building without warning and the new landlord tripled the rent in 90 days. She had been good at her job. She had been good at a great many things that had not translated into the kind of life people assumed a woman should want. By the time she was 38, the husband, the house. The particular variety of security that people in her family discussed at holidays, in the tone of voice usually reserved for the weather, as though it were simply something that happened to you eventually, if you were patient enough. Nobody had ever told Abigail she was pretty. They had told her she had a nice smile, which was the thing people said instead. They had told her she was funny, that she was warm, that she was the kind of person you wanted around in a crisis. What they had not done, not once in 38 years, was look at her the way she had watched men, look at her sister Pauline, at her colleagues, at women on the street, whose bodies fit the measurements the world had decided were worth looking at. She was not bitter about it. She had tried bitterness once in her mid-20s and found it required too much maintenance. What she was by the time she stepped onto that Greyhound in Chicago, with one suitcase and a coat too thin for where she was going, was tired. Tired of the bakery that was gone, the apartment that was gone, the careful, small life she had built out of second-hand things, and her own considerable effort, the life that had been taken from her, not through any failure of her own, but simply because she had not mattered enough to anyone, to be worth keeping in mind when the decisions were being made. Ethan Walker's letter had said he needed someone capable. It had not said anything about her size, her age, or what she was supposed to look like. She had answered it the same afternoon she received it. The truck turned off the main road, onto a dirt track that wound through pine and scrub for nearly a mile before the ranch appeared out of the darkness. Abigail looked at it through the cracked windshield and kept her face very still. She had seen pictures of Montana ranches. She had formed an image in her mind of what the Walker place might look like, worn but functional, the kind of working poverty that had its own dignity, like a pair of boots that had been resoled 3 times. What she saw was something further along than that. The main fence line ran crooked 2 posts, leaning at angles that suggested the ground beneath them had shifted, and nobody had gotten around to resetting them. The barn roof on the left side had a sag to it that would not survive another heavy snow. A second smaller outbuilding sat dark and slightly tilted, its door hanging open on one hinge. The house itself was 2 stories wide, fronted the kind of structure that had been built for a family that intended to grow. Several of the upper windows were dark. One had a quilt hung inside it instead of a curtain. Ethan Walker pulled the truck up to the front of the house and cut the engine. He sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel, looking at the dark windows, the way a man looks at something he has looked at so many times, it has stopped registering as something he can change. "Boys are inside," he said finally. "Most of them will be asleep. Luke won't be." He opened his door and stepped out. Abigail picked up her suitcase and followed him to the front door. The door opened before Ethan touched the handle. The boy in the doorway was tall for 19, broad across the shoulders, with his father's jaw and his father's way of holding his expression flat. He looked at his father first, then at Abigail. The look he gave her was not cruel. It was something more careful than cruelty, an assessment thorough and deliberate, the kind of look that reserved judgment while making very clear that judgment was coming. "Luke," Ethan said. "This is Abigail Harper." "I know who she is," Luke said. He stepped back to let them through. The inside of the house hit Abigail the same way the truck had, that hollow, used-up smell of a space that had been lived in hard and tended to barely. The front room held a wood stove that was generating heat, but not much a table with mismatched chairs and a pair of boots in the corner that were too small to belong to Luke and too large to belong to anyone very young. Dishes sat stacked in the basin near the kitchen doorway, not dirty exactly, but not quite clean, either rinsed and left rather than washed. "Rooms upstairs," Ethan said. "Second on the left, shared bathrooms at the end of the hall." He set her suitcase at the bottom of the stairs and looked at her for the first time since she had gotten into his truck. His eyes were dark and very tired. "Breakfast is early here," he said. "Work starts at first light." "I know," Abigail said. He held her gaze for exactly 1 second longer than necessary, then looked away and walked toward the back of the house. Luke stood in the middle of the front room watching her with his arms crossed over his chest. "How many houses you looked after before?" he said. "I managed a commercial kitchen for 11 years, she said. "Before that, I cooked for my grandmother from the time I was 9 until she died. I know how to run a house." "This ain't a house," Luke said. "It's a ranch." "Then I'll learn the parts I don't know." He looked at her for a long moment. "There's 5 brothers besides me," he said. "Mason's 17. He'll give you trouble. Not the violent kind, just the kind that makes everything harder than it has to be. Noah's 15, and he's already got 1 foot out the door, so don't take it personally when he acts like none of this matters. Caleb and Eli are 12 and 10. They're all right, mostly quiet. And then there's Samuel." He stopped. "How old is Samuel?" Abigail asked. 5, Luke said. His voice changed almost imperceptibly on the word something underneath it that he had worked hard to cover. "He was 2 when our mother died." Abigail set her hand on the bottom post of the stair railing. "Where is he now?" "Supposed to be asleep." Luke's jaw tightened. "Usually is by now." "Usually," Abigail repeated. Luke did not say anything to that. He turned and walked toward the kitchen doorway and disappeared through it, and Abigail picked up her suitcase and carried it up the stairs herself. The room was small. The bed, narrow, the single window facing west. She set her suitcase on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the house. It had its own particular sound. This house, the wind coming off the mountain pressing against the north-facing walls, the low pop of the wood stove downstairs, the distant sound of cattle shifting in the cold. Underneath all of it, barely audible, a sound that Abigail could not identify for a moment. Then she could. It was someone moving around in the kitchen below her. Small footsteps. Stop and start. Uncertain the kind of movement that came from trying to navigate a space by memory rather than by sight. She was down the stairs in under a minute. The kitchen was dark except for the faint orange glow from the wood stove in the front room, casting a thin bar of light under the connecting door. In that half-dark, a small boy was dragging a wooden stool across the kitchen floor toward the iron stove. His chin set with the particular determination of a child who has decided to do something and intends to do it whether or not the world cooperates. Abigail crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and caught the stool before it could move another inch. The boy looked up at her. His face was round still, carrying the last of the baby softness that 5-year-olds carry, but his eyes were older than that. Dark eyes, his father's eyes watching her with the same careful wariness she had seen in Luke's face upstairs. "I was going to make the oatmeal," he said. His voice was very small and very serious. "Nobody made supper." Abigail crouched down to his level. "When'd you last eat, sweetheart?" He thought about it with the total concentration children bring to questions they are taking seriously. "Lunchtime," he said. "Luke gave me bread." It was nearly midnight. "What's your name?" she asked, though she already knew. "Samuel," he said. "Are you the lady from the letter?" "I am," she said. He looked at her with those old eyes for a long moment. "Are you going to stay?" The question landed somewhere in Abigail's chest and sat there. "Yes," she said. "I'm going to stay." He nodded slowly, as though he was filing this information away in a place where he kept things that had been promised to him, a place that had been used enough to have developed its own particular kind of caution. "Luke says people say that," he said. Abigail looked at him for a moment. "Then I'll have to prove it," she said. "Now." You sit right there at that table, and you let me make the oatmeal. Can you do that?" Samuel climbed onto the nearest chair without a word, and folded his hands on the table in front of him, like a small, solemn gentleman, waiting for a meeting to begin. Abigail found the lamp on the wall hook, struck a match from the tin on the shelf above the stove, and got the kitchen lit. Then she opened the pantry. She stood in front of it for a long moment without speaking. There was a sack of oats, with maybe a pound left in it, 3 cans of beans, a tin of salt, half a jar of hardened molasses, a cloth bag of dried corn, flour in a barrel that was running low, 2 potatoes that had started to soften, a string of dried onions hanging from a nail. In the cold box near the back door, a small quantity of lard, a block of cheese rind, more than cheese, and 4 eggs. She had cooked through harder than this. She had cooked for her grandmother through 2 winters when money was genuinely scarce, had learned every trick a woman learns when she has to make something out of close to nothing. But standing in that pantry at midnight in a house full of hungry children, Abigail felt the full weight of what she had walked into settle onto her shoulders, and she let it settle, because she had learned a long time ago that the only way through a weight like that was to feel it clearly first before you decided what to do about it. She made the oatmeal with the molasses and a pinch of salt. While it cooked, she cut the 2 potatoes into a skillet with the lard and got them crisping. Added the last of a dried onion crumbled over the top. It wasn't much. It was what was there. She set a bowl in front of Samuel and watched him eat with both hands wrapped around it, like he was afraid it might be taken away. "Good," she said. He nodded without looking up from the bowl. She sat down across from him at the kitchen table and made herself think through what she had seen of the house, the pantry, the fence line, the barn roof with its dangerous sag. She had walked into collapse. That was the true name for what this was: not poverty, not hardship, but the particular condition of a family that had been trying to hold together without the right materials for too long, that had been spending down its reserves in every direction at once, and had not quite reached the point of acknowledging that the reserves were gone. She had 6 months at most before the question became not how to fix this, but whether anything was left to fix. The door from the front room swung open, and Luke came through. It stopped dead at the sight of her at the table and looked at his brother's empty bowl. "He wake you up," Luke said. "He was trying to make oatmeal on the stove," Abigail said. Luke's face did something complicated and then went flat again. "I told him I'd get him something when I finished." He stopped. He was supposed to be asleep. "He was hungry," Abigail said. The word landed in the kitchen the way truth lands, sometimes not loudly, but with a weight that makes the air change. Luke stood in the doorway with one hand braced on the frame and looked at his little brother, and for just a moment the careful flatness slipped, and Abigail could see what was underneath it. He was 19 years old, and he had been trying to hold 6 people together in a failing house, and he was so tired he was barely standing upright. "I'll handle the supply situation in the morning," Abigail said, her voice matter of fact, giving him something practical to stand on. "Make me a list of what the ranch needs, and what the boys need, and what your father's creditors have been asking for. I need to know the full picture." Luke looked at her for a long moment. "Why?" "Because I can't fix what I can't see clearly," she said. He was quiet for a beat. Then, "There's a lot to see." "I expect there is," she said. "Make me the list anyway." Samuel had fallen asleep, sitting up, his cheek resting on his folded arms on the table, the empty bowl pushed to one side. Luke crossed the kitchen and gathered his brother up. The way a young man carries someone he has been carrying for a long time, carefully, automatically, with a tenderness he would never have shown if he'd thought anyone was watching. He paused in the doorway with Samuel against his chest. "The boys ain't gonna make this easy for you," he said. He was not apologizing. He was informing her as clearly and honestly as his father had been clear and honest in his letter. "I know," Abigail said. "Mason especially," he said. "You told me." He looked at her for another long moment. "Why'd you come?" he asked. It was a genuine question, not a hostile one, the kind of question a person asks when they are trying to understand something and have run out of other ways to get at it. Abigail looked at the empty bowl on the table, at the pantry door she had left open, at the lamp burning on the wall that made the kitchen look almost like a place where someone lived, instead of a place where people survived. "I needed somewhere that needed me," she said. "And you needed someone who could stay." Luke Walker stood in the doorway holding his sleeping brother and said nothing for a long moment. Then he nodded once the way his father had done in the truck brief economical, a man's acknowledgement that something true had been said. He turned and carried Samuel up the stairs. Abigail sat alone in the kitchen and listened to the sound of the wind pressing against the north walls, and thought about the list she had asked for and how long it would take, and what she was going to do with what was on it. The lamp burned steadily. The ranch was quiet, and somewhere in the dark above her, 5 more boys slept in a house that had been dying since the day their mother stopped living in it. Abigail Harper sat at their kitchen table, folded her hands, and started making plans. By the time the first gray light came through the kitchen window, Abigail had already been up for 2 hours. She had found a pencil stub in the drawer beside the stove and a torn piece of brown paper bag, and she had written down everything she could assess from the pantry and the cold box without needing anyone to tell her. The list was not encouraging. She set it on the table beside a second piece of paper she had left blank, the one meant for Luke, and put the coffee on with the last of the grounds she had found at the bottom of a tin. The coffee was thin and bitter, and the best thing she had smelled since she stepped off that greyhound. She heard them before she saw them. Boots on the stairs, the particular rhythm of multiple people descending at different weights and different speeds. Luke came first, then 2 boys she had not yet met, then silence, then a third boy, and then nothing for long enough that she had turned back to the stove before the kitchen door opened again. The boy who came through it was 17, and he walked like he had decided before entering that he was not going to be impressed by anything he found. Mason Walker was built like his oldest brother, but carried himself differently, where Luke held his shoulders level and his chin straight. Mason had a slight forward lean to him, a posture that said he was always half a step ahead of whatever room he was in, and had already decided what he thought of it. He had dark eyes and his father's jaw, and he looked at Abigail standing at the stove, and then at the pot on the burner, and then back at Abigail with an expression that was 1 degree short of a sneer. "You're cooking," he said. "I am," she said. "With what?" He looked at the pan. "There ain't nothing in this house worth cooking." "There's enough," she said. He crossed his arms over his chest, the gesture identical to Luke's from the night before, except where Luke's had been, a wall built for defense, Mason's was built for offense. "Where you from?" "Chicago." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "City woman," he said to the room in general, as though there were an audience that had been waiting for someone to name the obvious. "Dad ordered himself a city woman." "Dad ordered himself someone capable," Abigail said. She did not look up from the pan. "Whether I'm capable is something you'll be able to judge for yourself by the end of the week." "Already judging," Mason said. Luke came through the door from the front room and took in the scene in one glance. "Mason." "I'm just talking," Mason said. "Then talk somewhere else," Luke said. Mason looked at his brother, then at Abigail, then pushed off the doorframe and dropped into the nearest chair at the table with the elaborate casualness of someone who is making the point that he is not going anywhere. The 2 boys who had come down with Luke were standing in the doorway behind him, and Abigail looked at them long enough to take them in. They were close enough in height to be the ones Luke had named Caleb 12 and Eli 10, and they both had the look of boys who had learned to take up as little space as possible in a house where the emotional weather was unpredictable. They watched her with the same wariness Samuel had shown the night before, except where Samuel's had been a child's direct and unguarded question. Theirs was the more careful watching of boys who had already been surprised enough times to have stopped expecting good things to stay. "Sit down," Abigail said to them. "Breakfast is almost ready." They sat. Mason said nothing. Luke poured himself coffee from the pot and stood by the window. Abigail set plates down flatbread she had made from the flour and lard crisped on the iron pan, with the last of the eggs scrambled and divided evenly, and the remaining potato from the night before sliced thin and cooked down with the onion. It was not enough. It was everything that was left, and it was not enough for 6 people, and she knew it, and she suspected Luke knew it, and she made no mention of it. She set the plates and sat down herself at the end of the table and picked up her fork. Mason looked at his plate. He looked at it for long enough that the table went quiet. "This all there is?" he said. "Yes," Abigail said. "This is what you cooked out of what's in that pantry," he said, and his tone had shifted. The aggression was still there, but underneath it, something else had come up, something harder to name. He looked at the amount on his plate, and then at Samuel's plate at the end of the table, and then he looked away out the window, and his jaw moved once. He ate. He ate every bite. Nobody at that table said a word until the food was gone, and then Luke set down his fork and looked at Abigail. "I'll make you the list," he said. "Thank you," she said. "What list?" Mason said. "Supply situation," Luke said. "Supply situation." Mason repeated the words in the same tone he'd used on City Woman, the tone that was meant to communicate that something was beneath genuine consideration. But he didn't say anything more, and that small silence was the first thing that told Abigail she might be able to reach him eventually if she was patient and didn't make it too obvious that she was trying. Noah came down at 7:30. He was 15, and he was already somewhere else. That was the only way Abigail could describe it. His body was in the kitchen, and his eyes were in the room. But everything that mattered about him was pointed toward a door she couldn't see. He had the same dark hair as his brothers, but he wore it longer, pushed back from his forehead in a way that suggested he had stopped caring about it, and he moved through the kitchen with the disconnected efficiency of someone completing a task they have mentally already finished. He looked at the empty plates on the table and said nothing. "I kept yours warm," Abigail said, and set the last plate on the table. Noah looked at it. Then he looked at her, and the look was not hostile exactly, but it was the clearest message she had received since arriving. It said she should not mistake his eating for gratitude, and she should not mistake his presence for agreement. "I ain't staying," he said, "after spring. I want you to know that now before anyone decides something else." "All right," Abigail said. He blinked. Whatever he had expected from that statement agreement wasn't it. "All right. You told me where you stand," she said. "I heard you. Now eat." He sat. He ate. He ate faster than any of the others, which meant he had been hungrier than he was admitting. And Abigail filed that away in the same place she was filing everything she was learning about this family quietly, without comment, building a picture. Ethan Walker came through the back door at 8, with cold coming off him and mud on his boots, and the look of a man who had been outside working for hours and had forgotten or decided not to mention that he hadn't eaten. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table at his sons, at the empty plates at Abigail standing by the stove. "There's coffee," she said. He poured a cup. He leaned against the far counter and drank it standing up, looking at the table in the way he had looked at the house the night before from the truck, the look of a man accounting for damage. "Luke's making me a supply list," Abigail said. "I'll need access to whatever funds are available for household expenses." Ethan looked at her. There was a long pause. "Ain't much," he said. "Tell me the number," she said. He told her. Mason made a sound across the table, not quite a laugh, not quite something else, and pushed back his chair. "Gonna be a real short list," he said, and walked out. Abigail looked at this number in her head. She had worked with less. She had never worked with this little and fed 6 people doing it, but she had worked with less in other ways, and she knew that money was a problem you could solve with enough creativity and enough stubbornness. What you couldn't solve with money, the particular quality of silence at that table. The way Ethan Walker looked at his sons, like a man looking at something. He was afraid he had already broken. That was a different order of problem entirely. "I'll need to go into town," she said. "Today if possible." "Luke can take you," Ethan said. He finished his coffee, set the cup in the basin, and went back outside without another word. Abigail stood in the kitchen for a moment after he left, listening to his boots cross the yard. Eli, who had not spoken a single word all through breakfast, looked up from his chair. He was 10 years old with a smear of egg on his chin and a look on his face that she recognized the look of a child who has been doing a great deal of watching and not much talking and has things to say that he has decided are safer left unsaid. "He didn't used to be like that," Eli said. Abigail looked at him. "Like what?" "Like—" Eli stopped. He looked at his hands. "He used to talk more. At breakfast. He used to tell us things." Caleb beside him did not look up, but he had gone very still, the way you go still when something is being said that you have been waiting for someone to say. "When'd he stop?" Abigail asked. Eli thought about it. "After Mama died," he said. "He stopped all at once, like someone turned something off." The kitchen was very quiet. "What was your mama's name?" Abigail asked. "Clara," Eli said. And then, as though the name had unlocked something he hadn't intended, "She used to sing in here, in the kitchen. She had a real loud singing voice, and it went all the way up the stairs, and we could hear it in our beds." Caleb pushed back his chair and stood up and took his plate to the basin and walked out of the kitchen without speaking. And the set of his shoulders as he went through the door was 12 years old, trying very hard to look like it was not about to cry. Abigail stayed where she was. She did not go after him. She had learned early that grief that is not ready to be witnessed will only run faster from a following. Eli watched his brother go and then looked back at his plate. "She's been gone 3 years. He said quietly, as though he was telling her something she needed to know for practical purposes. "I know," Abigail said. "Mason was the worst after," he said. "He punched a hole in the wall in the upstairs hall. Dad didn't fix it. It's still there." "I saw it," she said, though she had only noticed the shape of it in the dark when she came up the stairs. She had not known what made it. Eli nodded. Then he stood up and carried his plate to the basin the same way Caleb had carefully, with the deliberateness of a child following a routine that someone had instilled in him. He paused in the doorway. "The oatmeal last night," he said without turning around. "Samuel told me you made it. He said it was the best thing he'd eaten in a long time." He stopped. "I just thought you should know that." He walked out. Abigail stood alone in the kitchen of the Walker house and let out a breath she had been holding since she sat down at the table that morning. She had one day to go into town with whatever money Ethan had told her was available, buy enough to feed 6 people through the next 2 weeks, and come back with something that could pass for a plan. She had a pantry that was down to bare boards. She had 5 sons who ranged from quietly devastated to actively hostile, and a 6th who was 5 years old and had already learned to expect nothing so that the nothing would not come as a surprise. She had a husband who had stopped talking at breakfast 3 years ago and had not started again. And somewhere on this ranch there was a hole in the upstairs wall where Mason Walker had put his fist the day the world ended for him, and nobody had thought to fix it. Luke came in at 9 with his list. He set it on the table in front of her and stood back while she read it. She read it twice. She kept her face still while she read it the way she had learned to keep her face still when a number turned out to be worse than expected, which was a skill that working in a commercial kitchen for 11 years had given her many opportunities to develop. The debt column alone would have been enough to make most people turn around and get back on the Greyhound. She set the paper down. "The Henderson account," she said. "The one that's been calling since January. Is that the mortgage or the equipment loan?" Luke blinked. "How'd you know about the Henderson account?" "I saw the envelopes on the shelf by the front door," she said. 4 of them. Same return address. That's a creditor who's been patient for a while and is about done being patient." "Which one is it?" Luke sat down across from her. And for the first time since she had arrived, he looked at her not with assessment or wariness, but with something closer to relief. The relief of a person who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has just realized they are no longer the only one in the room who can read the situation clearly. "Both," he said. He consolidated them in October. "All right," she said. She pulled the brown paper toward her and turned it over. "Walk me through it. All of it. I need the full picture." He walked her through it. It took 40 minutes, and by the end of it, Abigail understood that the Walker Ranch had perhaps one good season left in it if everything went right and nothing went wrong. One good spring, one solid cattle sale, one stretch of weather that cooperated. If any one of those things failed, the Henderson account would come due in full, and Ethan Walker would lose the land his father had broken his back to build. She sat with that for a moment. "There's a greenhouse structure behind the east barn," she said. "It's not being used." "Hasn't been in 2 years," Luke said. "Pipes need work." "Can your father fix pipes?" "He can fix anything," Luke said. He stopped. "Hasn't had a reason," she said. Luke looked at the table. "I'm going to give him one," she said. She folded the list and put it in her coat pocket and stood up. Something in the way she stood, the solidity of it, the sense of a decision made and not subject to revision, made Luke look up at her with an expression she had not seen from him yet. It was not quite trust. It was the thing that comes before trust, when a person has been burned enough times to have learned to wait for proof, but finds themselves against their better judgment, beginning to watch for it. "You think you can fix this?" he said. It was not quite a question. "I think I can buy us time," she said. "Time is what we need right now. The rest of it we work out as we go." He was quiet for a beat. Then, "Mason's gonna fight you every step." "I know," she said. "He's gonna say things," Luke said. "About..." He stopped the way people stopped when they were about to say something about the way someone looked and realized they didn't know how to say it without making it worse. "He says things to get a reaction. That's how he's always been." Abigail looked at him steadily. "I've been called fat my entire life, Luke," she said. The word sat in the kitchen between them plain and unadorned. "By strangers, by people who were supposed to care about me by every room I walked into for 38 years. Your brother is 17 and he's in pain. He can say whatever he wants. It won't be the worst thing I've heard, and it won't make me leave." Luke Walker looked at her for a long moment. "My mother would have liked you," he said quietly. It was the most unguarded thing he had said since she arrived, and she could tell by the way his jaw tightened afterward that he hadn't meant to say it at all. "Come on," she said. "Take me to town. We've got a lot of ground to cover before dark." The trip into Carver's Crossing took 30 minutes on roads that had been bad in October and had not improved since. Luke drove the way his father drove, straight ahead, both hands on the wheel, not much conversation. Abigail did not push for any. She sat with the list in her coat pocket and the number Ethan had given her held in her mind and thought through what she could do with it and what she could not. The way she had always thought, through tight budgets, not with panic, but with the focused, almost pleasurable concentration of a woman who had spent her life solving problems that other people had already decided were unsolvable. The general store in Carver's Crossing was run by a man named Holt, who was 60 or thereabouts, heavyset, with a look on his face when Luke pushed through the door that told Abigail everything she needed to know about the Walker account before a single word was spoken. It was the look of a man who had extended credit past the point of comfort and had been waiting for someone to come through that door and acknowledge it. Luke saw the look too. His shoulders went tight. Abigail stepped forward before Luke could speak. "Mr. Holt," she said, "I'm Abigail Harper. I married Ethan Walker 3 days ago. I'm here to settle what I can of the account today and arrange a payment schedule for the rest." She set the money on the counter, a portion of what Ethan had given her calculated to cover enough of the outstanding balance to demonstrate good faith without stripping the household entirely. "I'd also like to put in a supply order. I'll need to feed 6 boys through the winter, and I'd appreciate your best prices on staples." Holt looked at the money. He looked at Abigail. He looked at Luke, who was standing slightly behind her with an expression that suggested he was watching something he hadn't expected and wasn't sure yet whether to trust it. Holt picked up the money and counted it. "This covers about half," he said. "I know," Abigail said. "The other half will come after spring roundup. I'll put that in writing if you'd like." Holt looked at her for a long moment. He was a man who had seen a great many people come through his door with more confidence than resources, and had learned to read the difference between bluster and substance. He appeared to be in the process of making that determination now. "You know how to cook," he said finally. 11 years running a commercial kitchen in Chicago," she said. He folded the money and put it in his apron pocket. "Meredith Graves has been after me to stock pie for the store since September," he said almost to himself. "Says her customers keep asking." Abigail kept her expression even. "I can supply pie," she said, "if the arrangement is right." Luke turned his head and looked at her sideways. Holt nodded slowly. "We'll talk about it," he said, "after I see one." He reached under the counter for his order book. "Now, what do you need?" They came back to the ranch 2 hours later with the truck bed loaded, not lavishly but solidly, with the kind of supplies that meant a household could function for weeks rather than days. Flour, salt, lard, dried beans, cornmeal, oats, sugar, a crock of molasses, dried fruit, a slab of smoked pork, coffee that was actual coffee rather than the ghost of it. Abigail had also bought seeds, a specific considered selection of seeds for the greenhouse she intended to start as soon as the pipes could be repaired. She set the seed packets on the kitchen table when they got back and went to find Ethan. He was in the barn working on something mechanical with the focused silence of a man who used physical labor the way other people used language to keep from having to think about anything he didn't want to think about. He looked up when she came in. "Pipes on the greenhouse," she said. "Can you fix them?" He looked at her. "What for?" "I want to start growing," she said. "We need a food source we control, something that doesn't depend on what Holt has in stock or what the weather does to the cattle." She held out the seed packets. "I bought what we need to start. I need the pipes working within the week if we're going to catch the right window." Ethan looked at the seed packets in her outstretched hand. He did not take them. "Clara used to grow things in there," he said. The sentence came out flat factual, with the particular emptiness of a fact that has had all the feeling deliberately drained from it because the feeling is too large to carry around functional. Abigail did not pull her hand back. "I know," she said. "Eli told me she liked the kitchen. I figured she probably liked growing things too." Something moved in Ethan Walker's face, fast gone before it fully formed the way a fish surfaces and goes back down before you can see it clearly. "The pipes aren't complicated," he said after a moment. 2 days, maybe 3. "Good," she said. She set the seed packets on the workbench beside him. "Thank you." She left him there. She was halfway back to the house when Mason came around the side of the barn and nearly walked into her. He pulled up short, and for a moment they were face to face in the cold. And she could see from his expression that he had been somewhere he wasn't supposed to be, and had not expected to run into anyone coming back from it. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them spoke for a beat. "Where have you been?" she asked. "Nowhere, that's your business," he said. She looked at his hands. There was something there, a particular way he was holding them slightly curled. The posture of someone who has recently been handling something they didn't want seen. "Mason," she said. "What?" "Whatever you're doing," she said, "I need you to stop." His chin came up. "You don't know what I'm doing." "No," she said. "But I know you're doing something, and I know it's because you feel like this family is going under and you're trying to stop it, the only way that seems fast enough." She held his gaze. "I've got a faster way. Give me 30 days before you do anything that can't be undone." Mason stared at her. The aggression was there, the forward lean, all of it. But underneath it, she could see the 17-year-old who had punched a hole in the upstairs wall 3 years ago and was still standing in that moment in some part of himself, still looking for something solid to grab onto. 30 days, he said, and the contempt in his voice was not quite as thick as it had been at breakfast. 30 days, she said. That's all I'm asking. He looked at her for another moment. Then he walked past her toward the house without answering, which was not agreement, but was not refusal either. And Abigail decided to count it as the closest thing to both she was likely to get from Mason Walker for a while. The first pie came out of the oven 3 days later. Abigail had used dried apples and brown sugar and a crust made with lard, and a pinch of salt, the same recipe her grandmother had used, the one she had made so many times, she could have mixed it in her sleep. She set it on the windowsill to cool, and within 4 minutes there were 2 small heads appearing at the kitchen doorway. Caleb and Eli stood side by side looking at the pie with an expression that was equal parts hunger and something more complicated, the look of children who have learned to want things carefully, who have installed a small buffer between themselves and what they want in case it turns out to be unavailable. "Can we have some?" Eli asked. His voice was studiedly casual, the voice of someone trying not to sound like they care as much as they do. "After supper," Abigail said. Eli's shoulders came down about half an inch in relief. Samuel appeared from behind his brothers, looked at the pie, and looked at Abigail. "Is that for us?" he said. "Second one's for the store," she said. "This one's for you." Samuel considered this information with the gravity he brought to all information. "The store doesn't need pie," he said finally. "The store does need pie," Abigail said. "But we need it more, so we get the first one." Samuel nodded as though this arrangement was correct, and walked away satisfied, and Eli and Caleb exchanged a look that she caught out of the corner of her eye. A small, quick look, the kind between brothers who are letting themselves feel something hopeful without fully committing to it yet. That evening, Holt came by the ranch in his wagon. He had not been out to the Walker place in 2 years, and Luke, watching from the front window, visibly tensed when the wagon turned up the drive. Abigail was already at the door with the second pie wrapped in cloth when Holt stepped down from the wagon. He unwrapped it, looked at it, pressed the crust with one thumb. He looked up at her. "Apple. Apple and brown sugar," she said. "I can do peach in spring when the fruit comes in, and cherry in summer if I can source the cherries." Holt rewrapped the pie. "I'll want 2 a week to start," he said. "If they sell, we talk about more." He reached into his coat pocket and held out coins the agreed amount. "And I told Meredith Graves about your situation. She runs the town social committee. She's been looking for someone to cater the spring fundraiser dinner." Abigail took the coins. "I appreciate that." "Don't thank me yet," Holt said. "Meredith runs a tight ship and she's got opinions about how things ought to be done." He paused. "She's also got a mouth on her, just so you know." "I've dealt with worse," Abigail said. Holt looked at her for a moment, with the same assessing look he had given her in the store, the look of a man determining the gap between what someone said and what they actually were. Whatever he found there seemed to satisfy him, because he gave a short nod, climbed back on the wagon, and drove back toward town. Luke appeared beside her. "2 pies a week," he said. "To start," she said. "Come spring more." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not going to save the ranch," he said. It was not an accusation, just the plain statement of a young man who had been doing arithmetic on this problem for longer than Abigail had been present. "No," she said, "but it's going to keep the household running without touching what's left of the cattle money. And it's going to build a relationship with the town we're going to need when the Henderson account comes due and we go looking for people willing to back us." She turned toward the house. "The pies aren't the point, Luke. The pies are just how we start the conversation." She heard him make a sound behind her, not quite a laugh, not quite anything. She had a clean name for, and she took it as a sign that he was beginning slowly and with appropriate caution to understand how she thought. What happened 4 days later, she had not planned for. Ethan finished the greenhouse pipes on a Thursday morning. He said nothing about it, did not announce the completion or come looking for her. He simply appeared in the kitchen doorway at mid-morning and said, "It's done," and turned to go back outside, and Abigail said, "Ethan," and he stopped. She looked at him. He looked back at her, waiting the way he always waited, patient, but at a distance, the way a man stands on one side of a river and watches what is happening on the other bank. "Come look at what I'm planning for it," she said. "I want to know if I'm thinking about it right." He almost said no. She could see him almost say it, the slight withdrawal, the way a person's posture changes when they have already formed the word in their mouth. But then something shifted. Something too small and too fast to identify, and he came into the kitchen, and she spread the seed plan she had drawn on paper across the table and walked him through it. He stood beside her and looked at the paper, and she could feel the careful distance he kept, the way he had arranged himself so that nothing about his presence committed him to anything. But then he pointed to the left column and said, "These'll do better if you start them in the second week, not the first. Ground temperature runs colder in this corner of the greenhouse. Clara used to start them late and they came in stronger." He said it the same way he said everything flat without inflection, the tone of a man reporting a fact. But he had said her name. Clara. He had said it in the context of something practical, something alive and forward-looking, and the word had come out without the hollow quality it carried when Eli had said it at the breakfast table. It had come out the way you say the name of someone who taught you something useful, someone whose knowledge is still in use. Abigail looked at this paper. "Second week," she said. "I'll adjust the schedule." Ethan nodded and straightened. "She would have liked knowing someone was going to use it again," he said, and walked out before she could respond. Abigail stood at the kitchen table and held very still for a moment. That was the exact moment she understood that Ethan Walker was not a man who had stopped feeling. He was a man who had locked the door and swallowed the key, because he did not trust himself to open it safely. And somewhere behind that locked door, there was a great deal he had been keeping from his sons, not out of cruelty, but out of the terrified conviction that if he let any of it out, all of it would come out, and he was not sure they would survive it. She thought about Eli's voice, saying he used to talk more at breakfast. She thought about Samuel at midnight on the stool with his chin set. She thought about the hole in the upstairs wall. She thought about 6 boys growing up in a house where grief had learned to disguise itself as silence. And then Noah came in. He came in fast, which was unusual. Noah moved through spaces as though he were trying to leave as small an impression on them as possible. But right now he was moving like someone who had news and had decided not to hold it. "There's a man coming up the drive," he said. "In a good coat. He's got a ledger." Abigail looked at him. "Henderson," she said. Noah's jaw tightened. "Luke thinks so." She folded the seed paper and put it in her apron pocket and walked to the front room. Through the window, she could see a man dismounting from a well-kept horse, dressed in the kind of coat that announced money without advertising it. He had the particular way of moving that men have when they believe their arrival matters measured deliberate, aware of being watched. Luke was already at the door. "Don't say anything," Abigail said quietly, and Luke turned and looked at her with an expression that might have been surprise or might have been relief, and she was not entirely certain which, but she stepped past him and opened the door before the man could knock. "Mr. Henderson," she said. The man stopped on the front step. He looked at her the full sweep of a man's eyes when he is recalibrating a situation he thought he had already calculated. He had come expecting Ethan Walker. He had come with a document in his coat pocket, and a speech prepared, and the particular composure of a man who is accustomed to holding all the cards and knows it. He had not come expecting Abigail Harper. "Ma'am," he said, and tipped his hat with the manners of a man who was covering his recalibration with courtesy. "I'm here to speak with Ethan Walker." "Ethan is working," Abigail said. "I'm his wife. I handle the household accounts. Whatever you need to discuss, you can discuss with me." Henderson looked at her for a moment. Behind her she could feel Luke's presence in the doorway, and somewhere further back in the house, the particular quality of silence that meant several boys were listening from places they were pretending not to be. "This is a matter of some," Henderson began. "Financial complexity," Abigail said. "I know. I've seen the ledger from our side. I'd like to see yours." She stepped back and held the door open. "Come in, Mr. Henderson. I'll put coffee on." Henderson looked at her. Whatever he had been expecting from this visit, an embarrassed rancher, a defensive confrontation, the particular vulnerability of a man who knows he is behind and cannot see his way forward, he had clearly not been expecting a woman who looked at him as though she had been waiting for him to show up so they could get the matter sorted. He came inside, and behind her very quietly, Luke Walker let out a breath that sounded like the first one he had taken all morning. Henderson sat at the Walker kitchen table for 2 hours. He had come with a document and a deadline, and the quiet authority of a man who had done this before sat across from struggling ranchers and laid out numbers that left no room for argument. He had a system for it the way men in his position developed systems, and the system was built on the assumption that the person across the table would be operating from fear. Abigail was not operating from fear. She poured his coffee, sat down across from him, and asked him to show her every line of the consolidated account. He showed her. She read each line without rushing, without the fidgeting or the defensive posture that told a creditor he had the upper hand, and when she was done, she looked up and said, "Your interest calculation on the equipment loan is running at a rate that wasn't in the original agreement." Henderson looked at her. "Page 3, she said. "The original terms were 7%. This column is running 8.5. That's not a rounding error, Mr. Henderson. That's 14 months of compounded overcharge." The kitchen was very quiet. Henderson looked at the ledger. He looked at it for long enough that his silence became its own answer. "That may have been a clerical," he began. "I'd like it corrected before we discuss any payment schedule," Abigail said. Her voice was pleasant. It was the voice she used when she meant something absolutely and wanted no misunderstanding about it. "And I'd like the corrected total in writing today, if you have the time." Luke was leaning against the far counter with his arms crossed and his face doing something she had not seen it do before. He was watching Henderson the way a young man watches a situation that has just tilted in a direction he did not expect and is trying to figure out whether to trust what he is seeing. Henderson recalculated. The corrected total took a meaningful amount off what had been owed. He wrote it on a fresh page and slid it across the table, and Abigail read it and nodded. "We can put 20% down today," she said. "The remainder in 4 quarterly payments beginning after spring roundup. I'll need the first payment date set no earlier than June given the calving schedule." Henderson looked at her for a long moment. "You know cattle schedules," he said. "I know how to read a ranch calendar," she said. "And I know that a creditor who works with a rancher's actual season gets paid in full. A creditor who doesn't gets foreclosure paperwork and whatever the land auction brings." She held his gaze. "Which do you prefer?" Henderson picked up his coffee cup, drank from it, and set it down. "June," he said. "First payment. 4 installments." He paused. "And the 20% today." Abigail reached into her apron pocket and counted the money onto the table. Henderson left 30 minutes later with a revised document, a signed agreement, and the look of a man who had come to conduct one meeting and found himself in the middle of a different one entirely. Luke waited until the sound of hoofbeats had faded down the drive. "Where did you learn to do that?" he said. 11 years negotiating supply contracts for a commercial kitchen," she said. She began stacking the cups. "A vendor tries to overcharge a bakery. You either catch it or you pay it. I learned to catch it. You just cut the debt by enough to make the quarterly payments manageable," she said. "Yes." Luke stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked at her with the particular expression of a 19-year-old who has just been shown that something he believed was fixed is in fact movable, and the understanding is still catching up to the feeling. "I need to tell my father," he said. "Tell him tonight at supper," she said. "All of them together." He nodded and walked toward the door and then stopped. "Mason was in the hallway the whole time," he said. "Behind the door." Abigail kept her voice even. "I know," she said. "I could hear him." Luke looked at her. "He didn't say anything. Mason always says something." "I know that too," she said. She heard Luke go out and stood at the counter and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of the relief she had not shown during the meeting, the shaky, adrenaline-edged feeling of having held a line under pressure and watched it hold. 30 seconds. Then she put it away and started on the noon meal. Supper that evening was different, not dramatically different. This family did not move dramatically. It moved the way damaged things move when they begin to heal, which was slowly and without announcement. But when Abigail set the food on the table and everyone sat down, Ethan Walker did not eat in silence. He looked at the account settlement Luke described and asked 3 specific questions: the interest correction, the payment timeline, the June date, and when Abigail answered each one, he listened in the focused way he listened when he was actually present in a conversation, rather than merely bodily located in the room where one was happening. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You caught the rate error," he said. It was there to catch, she said. He looked at his plate. Then he looked up and around the table at his sons, really looked the way he had not looked at the dinner table in what Abigail suspected was a very long time. Your mother would have caught it too, he said. The table went absolutely still. 6 boys who had been moving through the ordinary motions of eating all stopped at once the way birds stop just before a weather change. Every one of them caught between the fear that the moment would collapse and the desperate hope that it would not. Ethan picked up his fork and kept eating. She had a head for numbers, he said to no one in particular. Better than mine. She used to go over Holt's receipts every month. Said if you didn't check, you were just paying for other people's mistakes. He ate a bite. She was right about that. The silence stretched for one more moment, and then Eli said very carefully, as though testing the ice before putting weight on it. She used to make you show her the account book every Sunday. She did, Ethan said. You used to complain about it, Caleb said. I did, Ethan said. And something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the ghost of the shape that a smile would take if it came. And she was right every time, which was the irritating part. Noah looked up from his plate. He was looking at his father with an expression Abigail had not seen on his face before, the expression of someone watching a door open that they had believed was permanently shut. Samuel, who had been eating with the single-minded concentration he brought to all meals, looked up and said, I don't remember her voice. The table held its breath. She was loud, Mason said. He said it without aggression, without the forward lean posture, without any of the armor he wore to every other conversation. He said it the way you say a fact about someone you love plainly without wanting anything back from it. She laughed loud. You could hear her from outside. Samuel absorbed this. Was it a nice loud? Yeah, Mason said. It was a real nice loud. Abigail picked up her fork and kept her eyes on her plate and let the table do what it needed to do without looking at anyone, because some moments can only survive if no one makes them too aware of themselves. The town fundraiser was on a Saturday at the end of March. Meredith Graves had sent a note out to the ranch through Holt asking Abigail to contribute 4 pies for the baking auction and to consider helping with the supper service, which Abigail had agreed to. She had been supplying Holt's store for 6 weeks by then, and the word had gotten around Carver's Crossing in the way that words got around small towns, not loudly but completely. So that by the time she walked into the church hall, carrying a covered basket, most of the people in the room already knew roughly who she was. What they thought of who she was became clear within 10 minutes. She was setting up the serving table with 2 other women when she heard her name, not said to her, but said near her in the particular carrying tone of people who want to be overheard while maintaining the pretense that they don't. That's the Walker woman, a voice said. The one he sent for. Lord, said another. You'd think a man that desperate could have at least found someone. A pause calculated. Presentable. They say she's running the house now, telling Ethan Walker how to manage his own ranch. Well, he married whatever that is, so his judgment's clearly not. She's enormous. I can't imagine what possessed him. Abigail kept her hands moving. She straightened the cloth on the table, aligned the serving spoons, breathed through the tight thing in her chest that she had been breathing through her entire life, and knew the shape of better than she knew her own reflection. She had promised herself she would not let this matter. But it mattered. It always mattered, no matter how many times she had promised herself it wouldn't, because there was no version of standing in a room full of people while they catalogued your body as a public failure that did not matter. The only thing she could control was what she did with the fact that it mattered. She finished setting the table. She turned around, and she saw that Caleb and Eli were standing 6 feet away, completely still, looking at the group of women who had been talking. They had come in behind her to carry the second basket, and they had heard every word. Caleb's face was white. Not with embarrassment, with fury. The clean, clarifying fury of a 12-year-old who has just watched something happen that he does not have the framework yet to process into anything but rage. Eli was looking at Abigail. His expression said, "Tell me what to do with this." Abigail walked to them first. She put a hand briefly on Caleb's shoulder, Not pressing, just landing there, acknowledging, and looked at both of them steadily. "Take the basket to the kitchen and come back," she said quietly. "We've got work to do." "They can't say that," Caleb said. His voice was low and tight. "They can say whatever they want," Abigail said, "and we can choose not to give it more air than it deserves. Go." They went, but Caleb went with the rigid back of a boy who had stored something away that he was not finished with, and Abigail turned back to the serving table and found Meredith Graves standing beside it with the expression of a woman who had heard everything and was not certain what to do about having heard it. Meredith Graves was 50-something, sharp-faced, the kind of woman who ran church committees and town dinners and existed in a state of permanent competent motion. She had the look of someone who had opinions about everything and shared most of them, and had been known to be wrong about some. "I apologize for that," Meredith said. Her voice was direct, no flourish. "It's not yours to apologize for," Abigail said. "Dorothy Haynes has been running her mouth since before her first marriage," Meredith said with the brisk efficiency of someone filing a fact in its correct category. "Ignore her is my usual advice." She paused, and something shifted in her expression. Less committee chairwoman, more just a woman standing next to another woman. "For what it's worth," she said, "Holt says your pie is the best thing he's stocked in 3 years. "Holt is generous," Abigail said. "Holt is practical," Meredith said. "He doesn't say things he doesn't mean. It would cost him money." She picked up a serving spoon. "Now, you know how to run a supper service. I can see it from how you set this table. Let's get through the evening." The evening was going smoothly by the time Mason arrived. She had not known he was coming. He had not been mentioned in any conversation about the fundraiser, and she had assumed, given Mason's general disposition toward town events, that he would be at the ranch. But he came through the hall door at 6:30 and stood against the back wall, and she saw him from across the room and did not say anything. She understood why he had come approximately 40 minutes later when Dorothy Haynes found a fresh audience near the dessert table, and her voice carried again. This time she was looking directly at Abigail across the room, and she was saying something to the woman beside her. And whatever she was saying, she said it with a smile, and the woman beside her laughed, and the laugh was the specific variety of laugh that women use when they are agreeing that someone is ridiculous. She heard Mason's voice before she saw him move. "Something funny, ma'am." He had crossed the room in the time it took Dorothy Haynes to turn around, and he was standing in front of her with 17 years and every inch of his father's jaw, and a look on his face that was not the aggressive forward lean posture he wore at home. This was something quieter and considerably more dangerous. Dorothy Haynes looked at Mason Walker and then at Abigail across the room and back at Mason and said with the particular composure of a woman who has been the most powerful person in a room for a long time and has not yet updated her information. "Excuse me, young man. I heard you earlier," Mason said, "when you were talking about my stepmother." The word came out without hesitation, without the exploratory quality of a word being tried on. Stepmother. Like it had been there for some time, and was only waiting to be used. "And I'm going to ask you to stop." "Your stepmother," Dorothy said, and something in her tone suggested she was preparing for a different sort of performance, the kind where she reminded a teenage boy of his station. "My stepmother," Mason said, "who has been feeding my family since January with whatever she could find in a pantry that was down to nothing. Who sat across from our creditor and got our debt corrected and our payments scheduled so my father doesn't lose the land my grandfather built." His voice had not risen. That was the thing that made the room go quiet around it, not volume, but absolute unshaking certainty. "So whatever you think is funny about how she looks, ma'am, I suggest you think again." The hall had gone very still. Abigail had not moved from the serving table. She was aware of Meredith Graves beside her, of Caleb and Eli appearing from the kitchen doorway, of Ethan Walker coming through the main door at the exact wrong or exact right moment, and stopping just inside it, reading the room. Dorothy Haynes looked at Mason. She looked at Ethan. She looked at Abigail across the hall, and then she looked at the faces of the people around her, and found in them the particular quality of silence that is not neutral, the silence of a room that has just shifted its weight from one side to the other. Ethan walked across the hall. He did not walk fast. He walked the way he worked steadily without wasted motion, with the complete attention of a man who has decided where he is going. He stopped beside Mason and put a hand on his son's shoulder, and the hand stayed there, and the staying of it meant something that everyone in the room could see without being told what it was. He looked at Dorothy Haynes. "My son said what needed saying," he said. "I'll only add this." His voice was the same voice he used for everything level unhurried, carrying the particular weight of a man who does not spend words carelessly. That woman came to a dying ranch with one bag and no reason to stay, except that she chose to. She fed my boys when I wasn't doing it. She caught an error in a debt ledger that was about to take my land. He held Dorothy's gaze without anger, without heat, with something more permanent than both. "So if this town has something to say about her, say it to me, and then I'll tell you what I think of the opinion." The room was absolutely quiet. Dorothy Haynes said nothing. Her companion said nothing. The people around them said nothing, and the saying of nothing was the loudest thing in the room. Mason stood beside his father and did not move, and Abigail Harper stood at the serving table on the other side of the hall and felt something shift in her chest. Not the tight thing she had breathed through her entire life, but something that moved in the opposite direction. Something that opened rather than closed. She had not expected it from this family. She had come here willing to be useful and to be unacknowledged because that was the arrangement she had made with herself a long time ago to measure her value by what she could do rather than by whether anyone named it. She had not expected to be named. Not out loud, not in public, not by a 17-year-old boy who had called her nothing but the city woman for 6 weeks and was now standing in a church hall telling the town what she was worth. Meredith Graves leaned close and said very quietly, "I told you Holt was practical." A pause. "So is that family." Abigail picked up the serving spoon. "Let's get this supper moving," she said. "People are hungry." The drive back from the fundraiser was quiet in the way that quiet is different after something has happened. Not the hollow quiet of people with nothing to say, but the full quiet of people carrying something they are still sorting through. Ethan drove. Mason sat in the truck bed with Caleb and Eli. Samuel had fallen asleep against Abigail's arm before they left the church hall parking lot, and she sat with his weight against her and looked at the dark road ahead and did not try to make the quiet into something it wasn't. It was Ethan who broke it. "You heard them earlier," he said, "before I came in." "Yes," she said. He kept his eyes on the road. "I should have been there sooner." "Mason was there," she said. A pause. "Yeah," Ethan said. "He was." Another pause longer. "That's the first time in 3 years I've seen him stand in front of something instead of sideways to it." Abigail looked at the road. "He's been standing sideways to things because there wasn't anything worth standing in front of," she said. "Give him a reason, and he knows how." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had a different quality to it, not the flat managed tone he used for most things, but something underneath that, something that had been down there for a while and was coming up carefully. "I know what this ranch looked like when you got here," he said. "I know what the pantry looked like. I know what my boys looked like." He stopped. "I'm not—" He stopped again. "I don't have the words for what I mean to say." "You don't need to say it," she said. "I think I do," he said. "I think I've been not saying things for 3 years, and I think that's got to stop." He turned the truck onto the ranch drive, and the headlights swept across the fence line that Luke had spent 2 weeks repairing post by post after Abigail had put it on the priority list. "You came here and you stayed," Ethan said, "when you had every reason not to, and I don't know how to—" His jaw worked. "Thank you doesn't cover it." Abigail looked at Samuel sleeping against her arm. She looked at his round face and his father's dark lashes, and thought about the first night, the stool, the empty bowl, the question he had asked her with those old eyes. "Are you going to stay?" "I didn't come here to be thanked," she said. "I came here because this was where I was needed. That's enough for me." Ethan pulled the truck up to the house and cut the engine. He sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel, and then he turned and looked at her directly. Not the glancing assessment he gave her in the store. Not the careful maintained distance of the past weeks, but a full, unguarded look. The first one he had given her that had not been measuring the gap between them. "It shouldn't be," he said quietly. "It shouldn't just be enough." She held his gaze, and something passed between them in the dark cab of that old truck that neither of them named, because naming it would have made it too large to hold, and they both understood without discussing it that the right way to hold a thing like that was slowly and with both hands, and without rushing it toward being something before it was ready. Mason knocked on the truck window from the bed. "You two gonna sit there all night?" he said. Abigail looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at the windshield. "Get in the house," he said. Mason laughed. It was the first time Abigail had heard him laugh without an edge in it, and the sound of it was so unexpected and so genuine that Caleb started laughing too, and then Eli, and the sound of three boys laughing in the dark outside a Montana ranch house on a cold March night was one of the best things Abigail Harper had ever heard. Spring came in hard and fast, the way Montana spring came, not gently, but with decision. The cold breaking over the course of a week, like something that had been holding for a long time, and finally let go. The greenhouse was producing by the first week of April. Abigail had started the seeds in the second week of March, adjusted for the temperature variance Ethan had identified, and the first green had shown in the trays within 10 days. By the time the snow finished, there were rows of seedlings, tomatoes, beans, squash onions, herbs growing in the structure that had sat dark and closed for 2 years, while grief settled over it like dust. Ethan came in to check on the pipes one morning, and stood looking at the trays for a long time without speaking. Abigail was working at the potting bench, and she let him stand there. "She would have been in here every day," he said finally. "I know," Abigail said. "Eli told me." Ethan picked up one of the seed packets she had left on the shelf, a packet of sweet basil. Clara's handwriting on the label in faded pencil, one of the packets she had found tucked in the back of the potting bench drawer. Abigail had found it the first week, and had set it aside, and had not mentioned it to anyone waiting to see if Ethan would find it himself. He turned it over in his hands. "She saved seeds every year," he said. "Said store-bought never tasted the same as what you grew from your own." "She was right about that," Abigail said. Ethan set the packet back on the shelf carefully with the deliberateness of someone placing something in a specific location so it will be findable later. "Plant them when the time's right," he said. "She'd want them used." He walked out. Abigail stood at the potting bench and looked at the packet of seeds in Clara Walker's handwriting, and understood that she had just been given something that had nothing to do with seeds, and everything to do with a man deciding that the future was worth inhabiting again. The first Henderson payment went out in June on schedule. Luke drove it to town himself, and when he came back, he stood in the kitchen and held out the signed receipt, and looked at Abigail with an expression that was 20 years old, and trying to be more contained than it felt. "Paid," he said. "One down," she said. 3 to go. He sat down at the kitchen table and put the receipt down flat in front of him and stared at it for a moment. Then he said, without looking up, "I've been thinking about the agricultural college in Bozeman." Abigail kept working at the stove. "What about it?" "They've got a ranch management program," he said. 2 years. You come back knowing how to modernize the operation, how to deal with the financial side properly, how to expand." He paused. "Noah talked about leaving. I never did. But I think—" He stopped. "I think maybe leaving for the right reason is different than leaving because you've given up." Abigail turned around. "When would you go?" "Fall if I applied now," he said. He looked up at her. "If the ranch can spare me." "The ranch can spare you," she said. "Dad needs—" "Your father is back," she said. "He's been back since March. You know that." Luke was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "It's just—" He turned the receipt over. "I've been the one holding things together for so long I don't know how to stop without feeling like I'm dropping something." Abigail crossed to the table and sat down across from him. "Listen to me," she said. You held this family up with your bare hands for 3 years because you were the oldest and because there was nobody else. That's done now. I'm here. Your father's here. You're allowed to go build something for yourself." Luke looked at her for a long moment. His throat moved. "My mother would have said the same thing," he said. "Then your mother was a smart woman," Abigail said. "Apply for the program, Luke." He applied the following week. What happened with Noah came as a surprise to everyone, including Noah. He had been clear from the beginning, 1 foot out the door. Don't take it personally. He had somewhere to be that wasn't here. Abigail had taken him at his word and made no attempt to change his mind, because she had understood from the first morning that Noah's leaving was not really about the ranch, and trying to address the surface of it would only push him further away from the thing underneath. The thing underneath revealed itself on a Tuesday in July. Noah came into the kitchen at mid-morning when the house was quiet and everyone else was working outside, and he sat down at the table and looked at his hands for a long moment before he spoke. "I signed up for something," he said. Abigail set down what she was doing. "The telegraph office in Billings," he said. "They're training operators. It's a paid position room and board included starting in September." He looked up. "I know I said I was leaving. This is still leaving. But it's—" He stopped. "It's not disappearing. It's different." "It's very different," Abigail said. "I'm coming back for the second Henderson payment," he said. "And Christmas." A pause. The careful pause of someone who has been protecting themselves from hope for a long time and is in the process of deciding to stop. If there's still... "There will always be a place at this table for you," Abigail said. "Every Christmas. Every time you can make it." She held his gaze. "You don't have to earn your way back, Noah. You're already here." Noah looked at her with 15 going on 40 eyes, and something in his face came loose in a way that was almost painful to watch. The way it is painful to watch something that has been held rigid for too long finally release. "I didn't think you'd want me to come back," he said. "After the way I was at the start." "You were scared," she said. "You were watching your family fall apart, and you decided to leave before you had to watch it finish. That's not something to apologize for. That's just being human." He sat with that for a moment. "Mason called you family the other night," he said. "At supper. He said it like it was just a word, like he'd been saying it his whole life." He paused. "Mason's never called anyone family except the people he was born with." "I know," Abigail said. Noah looked at his hands again. "I just wanted you to know I see that," he said. "What you did for him, for all of them." He stood up and pushed his chair back. "For my dad." He walked to the door and stopped with his hand on the frame. "When I have my own place someday," he said, "I'm going to have a kitchen table that people actually sit at." He said it the way young men say things they mean with their whole chest, but won't look at you when they say them. Because of this one, he went outside. Abigail stood in the kitchen for a moment and then turned back to the stove, because the stove was where she put everything that was too full to carry around, and right now she was very full. The second Henderson payment went out in September. By then Luke was in Bozeman. He wrote letters, long, careful, detailed letters that arrived every 2 weeks describing what he was learning and asking questions about the ranch's operation that showed he was applying what he heard in class to what he knew at home. Ethan read the letters at the kitchen table after supper, and more than once Abigail looked up from her work to find him reading one for the second time. He never said what the letters meant to him. He didn't need to. The way he folded them and put them in the front pocket of his work shirt said it clearly enough. The morning that the last Henderson payment cleared, Ethan came into the kitchen before anyone else was up. Abigail was at the stove. She heard his step on the stairs. She knew his step by now. All of them. The particular weight and rhythm of each person who lived in this house. And she turned and looked at him and saw immediately that something was different. He was carrying the account book. He set it on the table and opened it to the last column and turned it toward her. She looked at the final figure. 0. Fully settled. The date written in Holt's handwriting because Holt had witnessed the transaction. She looked at it for a long moment. "It's done," Ethan said. "It's done," she said. He stood on his side of the kitchen table, and she stood on hers, and the account book lay open between them, and the kitchen was quiet. In the way it was quiet in the early morning, before the house woke up, the particular quiet that belonged to the two of them. "I need to ask you something," Ethan said. She looked at him. "When you came here," he said, "you came because it was where you were needed. That's what you told me." He held her gaze with the steady, unguarded look she had come to know, the look that meant he was not managing his expression, not keeping anything back. "I want to know if it's still only that, or if it's—" He stopped. "More," she said. He was very still. "It's more," she said simply. "It has been for a while. I just didn't think it was the right time to say it." Ethan Walker looked at her across the kitchen table with the account book between them, and the ranch paid off, and 5 sons sleeping upstairs, and 1 son writing letters from Bozeman, and another learning telegraph in Billings, and he said, "I think it's the right time." He came around the table. He did not move fast. He moved the way he always moved, steadily, without wasted motion, with the complete attention of a man who has decided where he is going. He stopped in front of her and looked at her the way he had looked at her in the truck, after the fundraiser, the unguarded look, and this time there was nothing between them, and nowhere else either of them needed to be. He put his hand against her face carefully, as though she were something he had been entrusted with and intended to treat accordingly. "I don't know how to do this well," he said. "I haven't done it in a long time." "Neither have I," she said. "We'll figure it out." He kissed her. It was not a grand gesture, it was the kiss of 2 people who have been standing on opposite sides of something for a long time and have finally crossed, deliberate and unhurried and entirely without performance. When he stepped back, the sun was beginning to come through the kitchen window. Samuel's feet hit the floor upstairs. Then Caleb's. Then Eli's, recognizable by the particular thump and drag of someone who always put his left foot down before he was fully awake. Then Mason, heavier, moving with purpose toward the stairs. Ethan looked at the ceiling and looked at Abigail. "Breakfast," he said. "Breakfast," she said. She moved to the stove and he moved to the coffee, and the house filled with the ordinary sounds of a family waking up, boots on stairs, voices overlapping the metallic scrape of chair legs on the kitchen floor. Samuel appearing in the doorway with his hair sideways and his eyes still mostly closed, walking directly to the chair he had claimed as his own, and sitting in it with the confidence of a child who knows his place at the table. Mason came in, poured coffee, looked at the account book still open on the table. He looked at the 0 at the bottom of the column. He looked at his father. He looked at Abigail. "Huh," he said. Just that. But the way he said it, the weight he put into one syllable, the thing moving in his face that he was not going to name out loud, because Mason Walker had never once in his life said anything that vulnerable on purpose, said everything. He sat down. Caleb and Eli came in together, the way they always did. Took their chairs, poured. Their water began passing the bread. Ordinary. Completely ordinary in the way that things are ordinary when they have finally settled into what they were always meant to be. Ethan sat at the head of the table. Abigail sat at the other end. Between them sat 5 boys, one loud and leaning back in his chair. One careful and watching the table, one already asking about the greenhouse. One still half asleep. One who had been trying to make oatmeal on a stove. He was too small to reach. On the night, a woman arrived with 1 suitcase and a coat too thin for Montana and chose to stay. The food was passed. The coffee was poured. Outside the ranch was waking up cattle moving in the pasture wind off the mountain, the particular quality of Montana air in October that was cold and clean and entirely itself. Nobody made a speech. Nobody said anything that needed to be remembered. But Eli looked up from his plate at some point in the middle of the meal and said to no one in particular, "This is what it used to feel like." And Mason said, "Better." And Samuel looked at Abigail with his father's dark eyes and said, "You stayed." "I stayed," she said. He nodded satisfied and went back to his breakfast. And that was the whole of it. Not a dramatic announcement. Not a moment designed for telling later, Just a 5-year-old boy confirming a fact that had become the foundation everything else was built on. She stayed. She fed them when there was almost nothing to feed them with. She caught the error in the ledger and planted the seeds and sat across from the creditor and stood at the serving table while people said the things people had been saying her entire life. And she stayed through all of it. Not because she was extraordinary, but because she had decided early that her worth was not a negotiation she was willing to have with people who had already made up their minds without knowing her. This family had not made up their minds before knowing her. They had let her in slowly and reluctantly, and with great caution, and they had changed because of it, not because she fixed them, but because she stayed long enough for them to remember who they already were. Years later, people in Carver's Crossing would still talk about the Walker Ranch and how it had come back from the edge of nothing. They would talk about the pies, and the greenhouse, and the Henderson debt paid in full, and the oldest boy who went to agricultural college, and the second boy who came home every Christmas without fail, and eventually brought a wife and then children to a table that had once sat silent and half empty. They would talk about all of it. But anyone who had been at that fundraiser in March remembered the moment that mattered most, not the greenhouse or the ledger or the paid debt, but a 17-year-old boy standing in a church hall, telling a room full of people what his stepmother was worth. That was the moment the Walker family became something again. And the woman who made it possible never once asked to be thanked for it because she had not come to be thanked. She had come to stay. And she did. Every single day, flour on her hands, boys at her table, Ethan Walker's boots on the porch steps. At the end of the day, Abigail Harper stayed. Because a woman who knows her own worth does not wait for the world to confirm it. She walks into the hardest room she can find, rolls up her sleeves, and gets to work. And she does not stop until the people in that room understand without any doubt that the best thing that ever happened to them walked through their door on a February night with one suitcase and a coat too thin for the cold, and stayed.